Hello, this is a little insight into the upcoming fourth edition of I can actually say, much awaited book, the Uncovering the Missing Secrets of Magnetism, the fourth edition. This is maybe a little Christmas gift for those that were waiting for the book. As I've stated in a prior video, field pressure dynamics are very simple. Mother Nature doesn't do math. The nature of field pressure dynamics is really very simple, but what is magnetism and what defines the magnet is unknown by humanity until now. When some of the greatest minds supposedly were asked, how do magnets quote unquote attract, or how do they repel? The great idiot and fool Richard Feynman squirmed in his chair, and then he gave an analogy of an old woman slipping on the ice, and really dodged and squirmed and wiggled. One of the most despicable videos that I've ever seen in my life. But he's a cult hero in the occult of quantum mechanics, which has quantized the entire universe full of unicorn particles, tachyons and gluons and muons, and Mother Nature is just an insane old lady with a bag of magic unicorn farts and pixie dust. Well, Mother Nature doesn't work that way. She only knows two principles fundamentally: force and motion, inertia and acceleration. That which defines 100% of the empirical, i.e. existential universe, is of course magnetism. That which is the air inside the quote-unquote balloon of the universe, be it from the atomic scale to the macro scale, is of course unquestionably so magnetism. That is certainly not up for debate. Now, I've told you before, and we'll explain further in greater detail in the fourth edition of the book, and the fifth and the sixth. There's so much material to add that this force divergence is defined by the reciprocating precessional hyperboloid, which superficially sounds rather complicated, but it is no more difficult than a child pulling the drain on a bathtub. It is no more difficult than that, I assure you. That which forms magnetism is a reciprocating precessional hyperboloid, the inverse image of which is the torus. Now, the dielectric and magnetic, as Faraday called dielectricity, he referred to magnetism as the dielectric field. Now, the magnetic field is, of course, the force and motion divergent torus. I've already explained that to you in a prior video. Now you have to look at the inverse image of the torus. Now, the inverse image, now if you don't know what a hyperboloid is, then go ahead and Google it. It basically looks like an hourglass shape. So the inverse, or the hyper-Euclidean geometry of course, Euclidean geometry is spatial geometry, but hyper-Euclidean or trans-Euclidean or hyper-spatial geometry, which is counter space, is the hyperboloid, the inverse image of the torus. This I've already also explained to you. Don't worry, I'm getting to the point here really quickly, at the point at which you'll have hopefully an aha moment, make things really simple, show you that Mother Nature has really got no tricks up her sleeve. She's as more simple, far more simple than you could possibly imagine. So now you understand the force divergence geometry and the trans-Euclidean geometry of the hyperboloid. Now this necessitates precession. As anything like a dog on a chain tied to a stake in the yard, if it's running around, it is always tethered to the point of inertia, the center point. No matter which way you go, it is always a curvilinear motion. There are no straight lines like this naturally. Okay, now this is an unnatural toroidal force divergence if you're to follow these arrows, but I'll get to this in a second when we're looking at quote-unquote magnetic repulsion, where this actually is true, but it is not something that Mother Nature ever does. It is a artificial, a synthetic force application that we refer to as magnetic repulsion. But what it is dielectric counteravoidance. It is literally the increasing the pressure of the torus. Because the dielectric counteravoidance or divergent pressure obeys the right-hand rule of magnetic field pressure necessity, which is a torus 90 degrees to the divergent pressure applied, or the hyperboloid perpendicular to the force divergence. Now, what am I talking about? Now, here is Mother Nature's dog on a leash. This is natural magnetic force divergence. It, of course, follows a curvilinear path. Now, this is a linear path along the line of a torus, but it is nevertheless linear. It is curvilinear to the toroidal shape relative to the prospective viewer, but it is unnatural. This, of course, is a magnetic repulsion, but this does not exist in nature. Under normal circumstances, Mother Nature does not apply pressures counter to pressure mediation. She works exactly like this. And of course, this is the pattern that you can see crosswise underneath the ferrocell. This is the hypertrochoid of the torus, which follows the curvilinear path. Now let's take a look at something specifically, because I know you're a little confused right now, but I'll straighten things up very, very quickly. Let's look at two different things. So you notice these are both the exact same image. All I've done over here to the right is rotate the image to the right, and I'm actually demonstrating two different field modalities: magnetic, what you would call magnetic attraction, and over here what you'd incorrectly call magnetic repulsion. But that's not the case. See, now, there's no such thing as a radiation or divergence that attracts itself. There's no such thing as radiation which is attractive. Now, magnetism, of course, is a dielectric field, and is certainly not radiation, but it is the loss of inertia. It is force divergence. So what do we have here? A magnetism certainly follows the right-hand rule. Now, two magnets accelerating has no different field geometry than does a single magnet, nor do five magnets already together. It is a pressure equalized torus. So let's take a look over here at the left at what you would incorrectly call magnetic acceleration, or magnetic attraction, excuse me. This is dielectric voidance. This is convergent dissipation of force and motion. Now, if you look here, and if you look at this underneath the iron filings, you'd actually see basically these little black lines underneath my red and blue lines here. But it would look like a sphere between the magnet, okay? But what you're actually seeing is a shrinking torus. Let me repeat that. You are seeing a shrinking torus. If you actually look at this cross-sectionally here, what you'll see is a torus that is shrinking. It is actually dissipating force and motion into the trans-Euclidean hyperboloid, which forms the negative image of the torus. Okay? This is the actual counterspatial acceleration that is occurring of the shrinking torus between these two accelerating magnets. Now over here we have something unnatural to nature. We actually have this pressure divergence right here. Before getting to that, let's first talk about magnetic acceleration, which is what is incorrectly called magnetic attraction. But it's not attraction. There's no force involved. They naturally accelerate without any force. It is the actual voidance of force, what I've specifically called dielectric voidance. It's the convergent field pressure dissipation that also obeys the right-hand rule of magnetic field pressure necessity, which is a torus parallel to the convergence of acceleration, where no pressure exists and under acceleration is undergoing entropy to rest inertia. You see, the torus is dissipating into the hyperboloid of the negative image of the spatial torus, which is, of course, denotatively the dielectric field, or the force and motion divergent Euclidean geometry. This is a dissipation into the trans-Euclidean hyperboloid counterspace. This is increasing inertia. This is why these are naturally accelerating. If you have a huge pair of magnets, for example, they'll actually crush your hand and break your finger. This has, of course, happened to more than a few people that made the mistake of messing with gigantic, dangerous neodymium iron borons or samarium cobalts. This entropy to rest inertia is the hyperboloid parallel to the acceleration which is occurring. Okay? This is a shrinking torus. Now, if we look at the inverse to this, this is the unnatural. This is the dielectric voidance, the dielectric countervoidance, excuse me, of divergent pressure, which also obeys the right-hand rule of magnetic field pressure necessity, which is a torus 90 degrees to the divergent pressure applied, or the hyperboloid perpendicular to the force divergence. See, all I've done here is I have actually two hyperboloids. All I've done is rotate the magnets 90 degrees so you can see the torus perfectly in the same position, but I've actually rotated the magnets to show magnetic attraction, which is incorrect, is dielectric avoidance, and magnetic repulsion, which is dielectric counteravoidance. But here you can see the force divergence that is occurring with the blue arrows here. You actually still have the torus here, but is occurring 90 degrees perpendicular to the force applied with increasing force, exponentially increasing force. This is, of course, how a railgun works, by the way. In very, very simple terms, this is how you shoot. Now, of course, there's theories that you could develop a very tiny space capsule, a very compact satellite, and we know that you could actually shoot a satellite into space using the same principle of a railgun. And this would be what you would call magnetic repulsion. You can see the force divergence occurring like an inflating donut. To keep it really simple, this is the unnatural turning upside down of Mother Nature, if you will. This is a parallel inflation of the donut and the force divergence. And now, of course, this is incompressible. Inflating the donut under repulsion only goes so far. The torus or donut is incompressible. It is only malleable up to a point, to the limits of its force divergent geometry. Okay, so now we see we have the torus on either side. We either have the shrinking torus or we have the inflating torus. Either way, we have the toroidal hyperboloidal formation, which forms either magnetic acceleration or force and motion divergence. We have force and motion, dielectric counteravoidance, and divergent pressure. Over here, under what you would call magnetic attraction, is convergent dissipation. Okay, in other words, you have inertia and acceleration. Over here we have increasing force and motion. This is obviously unnatural. Okay, things do not occur that way naturally vis-a-vis Mother Nature. And here we'll take a look at using iron filings, if we were to look at magnetic repulsion, and over here a magnetic acceleration. If I were to turn this on its side, you would see the same thing that we see over here, except now we see the shrinking hyperboloid in the center. The only thing you can't see is the hyperboloid that is shrinking here. We still have the toroidal formation, the torus right here, and over here magnetic repulsion. We still have the same thing, but we have the magnets 90 degrees parallel, 90 degrees perpendicular to the ones over on the right. This is magnetic attraction, is commonly denoted, and which is still incorrect. There's no such thing as magnetic attraction or repulsion. It is a dielectric avoidance and counteravoidance. We still have the torus in the exact same configuration here, except we have increasing force and motion. You can actually see that we do not have the hyperboloid shrinking here, but rather the compressional inflation. Not this geometry, the other geometry, the inflation of the torus, the donut of field pressure mediation. As is the case, there's absolutely no difference between a single magnet and its hyperboloidal geometry, the hyperboloid and torus, and that of two magnets that are coming together. They're one and the exact same thing. Here you see the shrinking torus, the hyperboloid, which you obviously cannot see the entire picture, but is still a torus slash hyperboloid. Euclidean and trans-Euclidean geometry, the positive image, which is the magnetism, the force and motion, and the negative image, which is the inertia and acceleration. They move towards counterspace, so that trans-Euclidean geometry. Mother Nature is really, really simple. It's just that humans are really, really stupid. This would be magnetic attraction, as you would call it, but you still have the same shrinking hyperboloid. Now, these are glued in place or held into place, but if they were to let go, they would actually fly together, of course, as you know, and the torus would immediately shrink. And its volume, the volume of the torus, which makes up the air, if you will, which is nothing other than magnetism, the air of the donut, would literally shrink right into the center of the negative image of the torus, which is the hyperboloid. That is that acceleration. Mother Nature is really simple. Everything is governed by force and motion and inertia and acceleration. Convergence, divergence, centrifugal, and centripetal. There is no math in Mother Nature. Math is a human contrivance. Obviously, math is infinitely useful for countless, endless billions of things, but Mother Nature does not have a calculator. Mother Nature does not do math. here's something else you need to consider, and it's no different than the magnet which I've outlined in black. We have passing a current through a coil of wire, and here you can see the hyperboloid. If you extend this out, you'll see the hyperboloid here in the center. And if you were to extend this entire picture out, you would still see the torus. And here you can see the force and motion divergence of the coil line. Now, if I were to place a magnet over top of this, the magnetic field flux divergence and convergence and the inertial plane is absolutely 100% no different than what we have here. And this is nothing other than a coil placed through a piece of plastic with iron filings on top of it. You can see the flux divergence and convergence through the center of the copper coil, which is actually a circle loop. The other side of the loop is underneath the plastic here. The field geometry is no different than the magnet that I actually have displayed here. 100% no different. This is the exact same geometry of a bar magnet or any other magnet. It is a torus, the center of which is the hyperboloid, and the very center of that is the dielectric inertial plane, which you can see underneath magnetic viewing film, and you can see incredibly brightly underneath the ferrocell. Now this is called the block wall by modern brain-dead science, but that doesn't mean anything. Descriptions are not explanations. One of the biggest heresies of science, and of course it's not construct, it is merely ignorance, is that descriptions are never explanations. You could say something is something and quantize its spatial vectors and field current influences, but those are only descriptions. That's not an explanation of what it is fundamentally. So now we understand the torus. The right-hand rule must be obeyed. We either have the inflating torus, which of course is still subject to the force divergence geometry of that torus, but it is only malleable up to a point. It itself is incompressible. You know, this is how rail guns work. At basically, they can shoot out at like, I forget, like Mach 20, 20 times the speed of sound, as I recall, some of the really powerful ones. This is, you know, an unnatural human contrivance, you know, used to shoot satellites into space and create hypersonic projectile weaponry, which of course the Army's been working on now for about 25 years. So you either have the inflating donut or the deflating donut, but either way, you are talking about one geometry and one hypergeometry. The geometry which forms 100% of the visible universe, which is magnetism, divergent force and motion, and the trans-Euclidean hypergeometry, which forms the hyperboloid, which is the hourglass shape, which is a negative image of the torus. And everything within nature, of course, is fields, and fields are not particles, but everything obeys this force and motion and inertia and acceleration torus. Everything. From macro to micro, nothing can escape the curvilinear geometry of force dissipation, force and motion, and inertia and acceleration. Like I said before many times, Mother Nature has no calculator. She doesn't use a calculator. Doesn't exist. Okay, it's something we humans use to quantize things. What we have here on the right is natural, the curvilinear force divergence of the torus. What we have over here on the left is the unnatural. This is the sort of inflating pressure applied to what you'd incorrectly call magnetic repulsion, the basis of rail guns and other hypersonic technology, and which forms the unnatural. But of course it is useful for certain devices and whatnot. So anyway, here's an insight into the fourth edition of the book, Uncovering the Missing Secrets of Magnetism. And I hope you all like that. And the simplest thing to take away from this is that the geometry of magnetism and the hypergeometry have to be known. There is not just geometry. Geometry is of the measurable. The immeasurable is inertia. It is that rest that is invisible, like a stick of dynamite. You can't see, you know, if someone's never seen dynamite before, you know, you can sit there and measure a stick of dynamite, you know, until the end of time, and you say it's made up of so-and-so chemicals, this and that, and so on and so forth, and then you light it off, and of course you have a gigantic explosion. It's like, well, where the hell was that before? You know, it was there in potential only, but it had no actuality. That is literally analogously no different than the unpresent, unmanifest trans-Euclidean geometry that defines inertia. the fundamental field principle of the entire universe. And this is irrefutable. You cannot quantize or measure potential. If someone didn't know, say, for example, what a stick of dynamite was or what it could do, I mean, you could sit there and measure it all day long. Well, it weighs a certain amount of grams. It's made of this chemical and that chemical. It weighs so much. And they could sit there and beat the dynamite on their head, but none of that means anything until you actually release potential. And when you do that, of course, if no one's seen it before, they'll be completely amazed. Where did that come from? All of a sudden, we have an enormous release of force and motion and divergent pressure. That sort of release of inertia is exactly what we're talking about. But you have to understand the geometry is so simple. The geometry is merely, very simply, the torus and the negative image of the torus. Anyway, thanks for watching. Catch you later, and Merry Christmas to everybody, okay? And Happy Holidays. Bye.